name's Atul. A bit of a background from my end. So I'm currently working as an assistant with Grant Thornton, Australia, Sydney offices. Previously, I've worked with EY India, Hyderabad offices and KPMG Singapore offices. All right. So a bit about InfosecTrain. For someone who is joining for the first time and haven't attended the webinar from InfosecTrain prior to this one. It was established back in 2016, and it is one of the best providers out there in terms of security training and technology training. We have got a lot of professionals, joined with us who provide training programs, webinars such as this, and we have got some consulting team over there who's closely working with Prab. And we do provide services in terms of providing certificate training, a targeted training such as CISSP, CCSP, and whatnot. We have got we have got a good clientele across Big Four banks as well, and we have got some of the good industry leaders who has joined with us in terms of training and consultancy and whatnot. And why InfoSec, if you would ask me, then we have got trainers who are quite certified, quite experienced in the field. They've got some real life experience who are more than happy to share with the wider audience out there. And the trainings are really flexible. You could attend online. If you're not able to attend any of those sessions, you would get access to the recorded sessions. The trainings are really tailor-made, so it's based on your needs, based on your understanding. The training is molded as such. And if there are any questions, concerns, and queries post-training, people are more than happy to help you out. I mean, there are a lot of students who are connected after the training, even after months, who want to seek guidance, who want to seek any, career solutions and whatnot. All right, so let's just get into right into it. So, practical guide to GRC. So, what exactly is GRC? So it loosely translates to governance, risk, and compliance. But when we talk about governance, risk, and compliance, we are pretty much embezzled by it, right? What exactly is it? How does it work? Do we require any, technical skills in this? Do we require anything else on top of technical skills or not? And this is where probably this webinar would give you a kickstart, give you an idea that what exactly the GRC role would look like from a practical perspective rather than being more theoretical. So I understand that there are a lot of courses out there. There are a lot of YouTube videos out there um, you know wherein you would see a lot of theoretical part about it, right? The real essence of this webinar and probably following from this, which is a course that I would be talking about towards the end of the presentation, is really to provide a practical guidance towards the implementation of the GRC. How exactly would a real life GRC would look like, what exactly a role would look like, right? So I hope this will provide that clarity. And if you stumble upon something, if you're unable to comprehend anything, or if you have any questions, queries, feel free to reach out to me after this session, or even if within this session, please raise your hand and I'm more than happy to take up any question. All right. So the agenda of this webinar is really to understand the importance of GRC from a cybersecurity perspective. So I have picked three security controls: third party security, physical security, and access control, access management control. So we'll not be deep diving because, frankly speaking, 1 hour is not really enough to dwell through all these three controls. But we will do touch upon the basics of it and what exactly does it look like, what exactly are we looking for, right? And then the importance of the technical knowledge in the GRC domain. And if you're working from a if you're an experienced personnel and if you're working in a different field altogether, right? And if you really want to start your career, kickstart your career in the GRC field, what exactly are we looking at, right? What are the sort of skills that we are looking at to build? What is governance? Governance is nothing really, but it's more like a leadership commitment, right? So imagine I being the CEO or the CTO of the firm, and if I don't have any visibility around what's happening within my firm, like let alone cybersecurity, if I don't know what's exactly happening within my firm, I wouldn't know what needs to be done probably 3 years or 5 years down the line. So to have that correct visibility the leadership commitment is the most important thing in the cybersecurity, right? There are cases wherein the leadership commitment is really not present, and the entire cybersecurity strategy goes for a toss, right? We might have the most expensive tools in the world, and if you don't know how to use it, and if you don't know what exactly are we looking for in that, it's as good as nothing. So it's more really the alignment of control processes and procedures around the company's objective. Say if I'm operating into a manufacturing firm, right, or into a pharmaceutical firm, it's more it's more focused sector, right? It's more regulated sector, and that's where my company objective would be to make sure that any data that comes into my company or that travels out of my company should be governed properly. So that's the leadership commitment that we spoke about, right? The other part is the policy framework. The policy framework is it's more like what framework have we adopted, right? So usually we would see, let's hold on, sorry. Usually what we would see that we have ISMS framework, right? Most of the US firms would go for NIST framework, NIST CSF framework. We have got 2.0 right now. And we would be talking about this as well because NIST 2.0, I'm sure people who have heard of, and even if you don't, they have introduced a new function called govern. Now, govern really focuses on the governance part of it, right? That who does what? That's the second point, right? Who does what? How exactly is it done right now? And what kind of data do we have? And based on that, the entire framework would be built. Now, say we have got some PII data, we have got some really pH sensitive health information, right? Who exactly is handling that? What are the business processes, right? Say we have got ops team who is handling the influx of the data. We have got IT team who is really focused on making sure that data is protected and encrypted and it is masked and whatnot to make sure that data, even if it gets in the hands of the threat actor, it is of no use, right? And how exactly is it done? It's exactly through the framework, and these frameworks needs to be coming from the top management, and they need to make sure that things are really going into the right direction. I'm sure that people who are already working in the GRC, and if not GRC, if they are really working into the IT audit part of it, right, the SOX compliance and SOC 1 and SOC 2, they would really see that any policy or a procedure that would be reviewing, they would have a proper sign up from either the board or any one of the C level executives. The next point is really maintaining the balance between security and the company's internal and external stakeholders. Now, this is really an interesting point to me because a lot of companies, I've worked with some of the, I mean, I have had the opportunity to work with some of the big four banks across the globe, some of the Fortune 100 and 500 companies, and I've really seen that maintaining the balance between security and the stakeholders are really difficult, right? It might sound really silly, but it is difficult, right? As an internal stakeholder, so I'll just give you a scenario rather. I'm working with one of these clients recently, and their internal stakeholder. In big quotes, I'm working with their IT team to define their framework and make sure that the data is being protected. It's one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies across the globe. So their IT team is not really, great to work with, to be frank, and they want it to be really secured, and they want to invest in a lot of tools, right? Because from their perspective, they're right because it will not only make your repetitive tasks redundant using some of those tools out there in the market, but it will also help you manage the data properly, and that's where the internal stakeholder interest lies, right? And that's just one of the examples of, I mean, you'll have multiple layers of uh, interest from an internal stakeholders perspective. It's just not technical. It's more amalgamation of both technical and the non-tech part, right? And from a company's perspective, I really don't have the budget to invest that much into the security part right now. And it really depends on the company's vision and their priorities at the moment. And that's where you balance security needs and balance the stakeholders' requirements and the needs at that time. The next one is really around the definition of the roles and responsibilities across your board, C-level executive, and your key departments. Right. Now, from the C-level executive, if you've got CIOs, CTOs, and if you've got CISOs, you've got CROs, right? So specifically, if I talk about CIO, CTO, and CIO, they're very tech-savvy people, right? If not all, at least most of them would know that, from a security perspective, from a technology perspective, what exactly are we looking at? What exactly do we need, right? Now, in those terms, it is really easy for these C-level executives to understand that, yes, I do have a deficiency, I do need to build up upon my framework, right? However,
Let's say for instance, if you want to really get funds from the board, right, and if you want to implement, let's say, a DLP tool, right, and if you really want to get the fund and whatnot, in that cases, you need to translate the technical bit. You really need to the technical bit into the business language, and that's where the real challenge arises, right? Now I had a situation with one of the government agencies in Australia, wherein we were really trying to help the board understand that DLP is a real problem, right? Data leak from the mobile phones, data leak from emails, data leak from USBs and whatnot. It's a real deal, right? And we really need to have some sort of DLP tool, and if not tool, at least some sort of mechanism to make sure that data leak is prevented, right? And they were not really understanding that what exactly do we need to do. And they will throw a bunch of layman questions, and we need to be ready with the answers to make sure that all the technical details that we are trying to convey are really translated into a language which they understand. So it's again an amalgamation between the technicalities and the business acumen, and that's where the GRC comes into play. And the governance plays a real it plays a real influence on the processes that we have. So in the interest of time, I'll move on to the next one. The next one is really risk, right? And I guess it's one of the most important pillars out there in the GRC. Now, the first process, or really, I'm sure if you have read ISO 31000, or if you have read the NIST RMF framework, you would really see that we need to identify the assets, and which makes sense, because if you really know that what your assets are, and assets, when I say assets, is not really the hardware asset, because that really gets confused between the terminologies, and it gets lost into translation. So we need to make sure that we do know who are our people, right? Who are our key stakeholders? What hardware are we using within the firm? What software are we using within the firm, right? And this is a new term. I will not deep dive into the libraries, but if you get some time after this, just read about SBOM. So this is a new concept that came in a few months back, or probably I'd say a few years back, but a few months back it started to gain traction. It's nothing but a list of libraries that we use within the firm, that we pull from GitHub or any public or private or paid libraries that we are using with the versioning. It is to make sure that we have all the list of libraries and its known vulnerabilities, so that we can mitigate as much as possible. Because if we know what we are using, and that's the thing, that's the place wherein we will start to identify the vulnerabilities and whatnot. And then we'll start to identify, after we know what our assets are, we'll move on to the next one, is to identify vulnerabilities associated with that. So for instance, if you are using workstations and laptops and whatnot, what are the risks, right? The risk could be laptop, laptop getting stolen, right? And the data being exfiltrated, and whatnot, right? So we really need to understand that what are our inherent threats, and then we really deep dive into the risk rating. I would not deep dive into the formulas right now; it will consume some time. But if you want, I can share. I can share some. I can share some formulas, and I can share some risk template, risk assessment template, so as to better understand. I do have a video with Prab on risk assessment as well. If you want to see a real good deep dive session into that, it's a 2 hour session. It's on YouTube, so you could see that. The next one is really to understand what controls do we have to make sure that even if the laptop gets stolen, the threat actor, if it gets into hand of any any unknown, they would not really do anything about it. They can't really do anything about it. The only loss that I would incur as a firm would be the asset loss, but not the data loss, because at times you would see that the data loss is much more higher in value as compared to asset value, and that's really important for me as a firm or for me as an individual as well, right? And then you would be mapping those controls, its effectiveness, its residual rating. So residual rating is nothing but, say, if the so say if the risk, if I have to scale between 1 to 5, 5 being the highest risk and 1 being the lowest risk, right? So before applying the control, if my risk was 5, which is the highest level of risk, and after applying the control, my risk trimmed down to 2, which is a low kind of stuff, right? This becomes my residual risk. This becomes my residual risk. But this residual risk needs to be mapped to my overall enterprise or corporate risk management framework. Because at times in the bigger firms or in the bigger enterprises, you would see that we have got an enterprise risk management, and within that we have got multiple risk management framework or assessments. As such, we'll have operational risk management, we will have cyber risk management and financial risk management, right, and so on and so forth. And that becomes the overall part of the enterprise or the corporate risk management. So we need to make sure that whatever residual risk that we have, it aligns with the corporate risk management. If it does not, we might need to go back and make sure that we do have the appropriate controls and whatnot. Apart from the business and risk, apart from the business, that means your the cyber risk management, the framework also needs to be meet legal, contractual, and internal and external goals. What exactly do we mean by that, right? Say if you're operating into a European region, right, and you need to comply by GDPR, right? You need to make sure that whatever risks that you have identified in your risk register and whatever data that resides in your within your network aligns with the GDPR requirement, as well as your enterprise risk management. So you need to make sure that your legal, contractual, and your internal and external obligations also aligns with your enterprise risk management, which becomes really tricky at times. Compliance, it's a good one. I think someone who's really working on the IT audit side of it, they would really be knowing about the COSO framework, which is top 1, 2, and 3. And we have got ISO framework as well, which is your 27001, which 2022 came into play. We have got 27701, which is your privacy, right? So we have got multiple frameworks out there. So compliance doesn't really mean, or at times we do get confused, and it used to happen to me as well, to be frank, right? Because compliance doesn't only mean that you need to meet the local law regulation. You need to make sure that you also meet the standards and the frameworks that you are following, right? Say that if you are a gateway company, right? Or if you're really holding sensitive card sensitive data, you need to make sure that you're aligning with PCI DSS um, uh, to cater to your clients, to your prospective clients, because they would look for PCI DSS certifications and whatnot, right? Along with ISO, of course, right? So in those cases, not only you need to align with the laws and the local laws and the regulations, but you also need to align with the PCI, ISO, and whatnot. That brings me to my first point. You must know what compliance obligations do you need to comply to, right? If you don't know that in the first place, mate, you're gonna get doomed, because you need to make sure that, say if you're operating into the European region again, right? You need to document that you have to follow GDPR as a part of your laws and regulations and reforms and whatnot. You also need to make sure that you are following PCI DSS, you are following ISO, in a 3 year cycle, or per year, the surveillance audit or whatnot. And you need to list down all the XYZs of compliance that you need to comply to, right? And once you do that, you have a better clarity around that, and then you can make your assessments, and you can build a framework around it to make sure that you're complying with all the controls out there, right? And then managing those controls and testing those controls are a different game altogether, but that's not something that we'll be covering in this session. But if you want to really understand that, feel free to reach out. So that's really about the overview of the governance, risk, and compliance, the GRC part of it. Now, the next one really is that why do we need GRC in the first place? Can't we just implement tools and just get away with it, right? And that's not how it works. It used to work probably 5 to 7 years prior to today that we are speaking of, but not in today's era, and it's not going to. Going to go anywhere in the next 10 years probably, because GRCs become the hour of the need of the hour, because you need to have a proper framework to make sure that you have all the regulations and all the governing and controls around in place for what you need. So what are the importance of GRC? Now, as a firm, if I have a vision that 3 years down the line, I need to make sure that my cybersecurity controls, or whatever controls that I have in place, should reach a maturity of, let's say, 4 out of 1. If on a scale of 1 to 5 level of maturity, I need to reach 4 in the next 3 years, right? That becomes my vision, and that becomes my mission as well, right? And this will align to your GRC goals, and this becomes your GRC code. And that brings me to my first point. The first point is really to improvise your cybersecurity, aligning better with your company's vision and objective. Every year, if some of you have really dealt with the C-level executives, or you are yourself one, you would know better that the company's vision, objective, and mission. I think I missed that, the mission word, but the company's vision, objective, and the mission, if not refreshed, it gets updated, reviewed at least quarterly. They need to be circling back, and they need to make sure that we are on the same page, and we need to make sure, as a C-level executive, that our vision, mission, and objective meets the overall company's requirement as well as the security requirement. If I have to speak in cybersecurity language, right? It also helps in enhancing our cyber resilience, right? What exactly is cyber resilience? Probably you could look out for that, but in the interest of time, if you have a visibility, right, that what controls are working, say that if you have access control in place, we have got incident management, right? You have you've got incident management, you have got third party risk management, right? So in those cases, you know that across these three areas, right? I'm just taking these three examples out of my mind, but we have got plethora of list out there, right? But I'm just taking three of these list out in mind. If as a board, if not as a board, if as a C-level executive member, as an executive member, if I know that my controls are working as expected across these three areas, right? And I know that where am I lacking, I would be able to take action on those based on the severity, or based on the priority, rather, I would say, right? And in case of any worst case scenario, if you have a ransomware attack, if you have a data breach, if you have a cyber breach or whatnot, right? In those cases, you would know that I have a robust incident management in place. I have a robust DR and BCP in place to tackle those kind of situations, right? Because remember one thing, risk can never be zero. It can never ever be zero. There will always be a risk, right? I mean, in case of DLP as well, right? If I have a malicious intent, even if you block USBs, file uploads to the maximum, even if you block Facebook, social media, WhatsApp web, Telegram web, and whatnot, right? Even if I have a malicious intent, I'll just take a photo of this from this screen and send the data to whomsoever it may concern, right? So if I really do have malicious intent, I will find a way out. Henceforth, the risk cannot be zero. However, you can mitigate the risk to an acceptable level of your risk appetite, right? So say that on a scale to five, I mean, taking a step back onto the risk portion that we spoke about, say on a scale to one to five, your appetite of cybersecurity as a whole is somewhere around two, right? However, your current posture says that right now my risk posture is three. You have a problem here. You need to make sure that you trim down to two, right? And that's where this is your appetite. You really cannot, you really cannot underestimate or problem. You cannot overlook having risk above two, not even 2.1, right? And that's where you need to have a proper framework in place, proper governing framework in place. Now, coming back to the importance of GRC, the next one is really the controlled operational cost. Now, what exactly is operational cost all about, right? The operational cost is not only running the technology and monitoring the technology, it's your people skills as well. You're putting a lot on your people, right? You've got a SOC team. They work 24 by 7, right, to make sure that none of the threat actors get into our network, and we do our best to in lieu of that, right? people are People are the most crucial and important asset in the entire cybersecurity world, right? We have got technology, right? And we have got processes. So a proper GRC would make sure that you effectively use the number of people that you have within your team. You effectively use of whatever technology that you have at your disposal, and you make sure that you define the process in such a way that you do not have any overhead, right? And that way, when people, process, technology work together, you make sure that your operational cost is controlled. Because even if you invest, say, $100,000, right, and if your operational cost per year is somewhere close to 70K, there's something wrong with it, right? Because over a period of 5 years, this is going to be a big investment, and you'll have to justify that, right? The next point is really around the transparency and visibility. If we have a proper GRC in place, will have a proper transparency and visibility from the top down, right? From an executive perspective, I'll have a transparency, and I'll have a visibility as to what my team is doing on a ground level, right? If someone here is working, again, working in IT audit or some of the GRC, and if not GRC, let me put it this way: if any one of you is working M and above here, right, you would know that there are certain metrics needs to be reported every month, if not daily, right? And these metrics across different areas, access, incident, right, third party, risk management, yeah, blah 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 blah. These metrics needs to be reported to your exec, right, on a periodic basis, right? And the executives would be reporting to board on a periodic basis. So say, for instance, if this periodic is quarterly, this would be yearly. I'm just taking a random example out of one of my experiences with the recent clients, but this is how a typical metric reporting system would look like, and this varies from company to company, their preferences, their priorities, and and whatnot. The last one is really operating under the risk appetite, and this was the example what I spoke about, right? This is the example that I spoke about. If you know what you're doing, and if you have a proper transparency and visibility, you would know what your risk cap are you operating under your risk appetite or not, right? Say if you have a um, data in transit, right? And if you're using TLS 1.0, which is a deprecated version and not recommended by the NIST and Google as well, right? And you really want to update to 1.2 or 1.3, right? And this doesn't fall under your risk appetite. Now, this particular process or this particular investment would go through all the processes. Is it really needed, right? Does that align with my vision and objective? Does it help me with the cyber resilience? Does it reduce, or if not reduce, at least not overhead in terms of operational cost? And lastly but not the least, does it help me with the meeting the risk appetite? So that's really the importance of GRC. The next three slides is really to understand the basic need of controls from third-party management. The next one is access management, and the next one is the subsequent one is the physical security one, right? So starting with the third party risk management, I'm sure that you would have heard of certain breaches in the recent past, wherein due to third party breach, the main company gets breached, right? And one of the classic examples was your Uber, T-Mobile, and LinkedIn, right? And they had breaches due to the third parties. It was not their mistake, but it was one of the third parties which they were using, right? And why do we on third parties in the first place? Can't we do, can't we pull the shit together and do things ourselves, right? And there are a number of reasons why we outsource the entire process, the technological or the non-technological process, to a third party. Maybe, efficiency could be one of those reasons. The money part could be another reason, right? But for any reason, if we are outsourcing to a third party, we need to make sure that we have a proper vendor risk management in place. And this is really painful. This is really painful because at times I have seen companies expecting a 500 questions from the vendor to be filled up and then reviewed by the company. And if there are any deficiencies or anything of that sort found, they go back to the vendor to resolve that. And this entire process takes 6 months, 6 bloody months. Can you imagine? By the time I evaluate and by the time my vendor is onboarded, might as well I could do things in-house, right? And that's where there are certain tools like Upgrad, right? They come into play. They automate certain tasks. They automate certain things in terms of vendor security, through through data mining the public available information and whatnot, and that reduces a lot of effort on both the sides, including your vendor and the real organization, right? So in certain cases, you need to make sure that whatever vendor that you are assessing, you ask meaningful questions, right? And it solely relates to what kind of services are they going to render you, right? And you would see a lot of questionnaire around: do you have a SOC 2 type 2, right? Do you have a do you have a ISO 27001 ISO certification and whatnot, right? And let me tell you that in the Indian market as well, and in the South Asian market and in the Australian market that I have worked with a lot of companies, most of the times if they're asking these kind of reports, they wouldn't even bother to look at the scope, right? Which is really, it's the first thing that you would look at, right? Does the scope of these assessment overlaps the scope on the services that you are trying to render from the vendor? And that's how you assess a SOC 2 type 2 report, or an ISO, or any report for that matter, or any internal audit, or anything for that matter, right? And that's where you would run an appropriate, or probably I would say more effective, risk assessment activity, right? The next one is really having a security. I think I misspelled that. So this is vendor security policies and procedure. You need to have a process around it, right? So right from the procurement of the vendor to offboarding the vendor, you really need to have a proper policies and procedure in place. If the next one is, if you really want to give access to a third party vendor to your to your third party, to your internal network, you need to have restrictive control. You need to have a proper logging and monitoring of the access, what exactly is going on, and sort of stuff, to make sure that there are no unauthorized activity, there are no malicious activities within your network, and not trying to move around, right? The next one is really to understand the data protection mechanism adopted by the third party, because if you are trying to hand over some of the data, some of the PI, to a third party for whatsoever reason, you need to make sure that your data that you're trying to provide to your third party is really protected, right? The next one is really important, and the last 2 points goes hand in hand. So the security assessment and audits, and the vendor monitoring, so these activities needs to be done on a periodic basis on your vendors, to make sure that whatever services that vendor is trying to render you, they are doing in a rightful manner. they're meeting all the SLAs, they are meeting all the security requirements, right? They are meeting all your access requirements in case if they have a if they have an access control in your sorry, if they have access in your network, right? Those sort of stuff. So you need to make sure that you monitor your vendors on certain aspects on a regular basis. All right. So the next one is really around the access control. So the access control is, I mean, it goes by the name that you need to restrict access. You need to make sure that the access is rightfully given to the user. So in the industry, I'm sure everyone would know of is that we follow the principle of least privilege access, right? So if you're providing an access to anyone, right? So if I'm being onboarded as a network security manager, right, or NetSec manager or NetOps manager or anything like that, right? Even if I'm being onboarded on a certain privilege, my first level of privilege or my first entry point on in the network shouldn't be as privileged as I should be giving at a later stage. It should always be the best practice is to give a least privilege access to your network, and then based on the approval internally from the CISO, CTO, or your higher line manager or so, you could be provided with the relevant privilege access. And that is something, it's a very minute difference from giving the most level of privilege access to certain user who's joining as a manager or someone at a higher level, because it might sound too minute, but at times it's really good to practice those kind of practices within the firm. The next one is really on the access right management process. Again, it boils down to your policies and the procedures, because all the policies procedure needs to be governed by the senior management, because they, as a senior management, I wouldn't be looking at the exact process on a day-to-day basis, right? So there needs to be a policy, there needs to be a procedure in place to every cybersecurity area that we look at, because as an executive, I know that anything that happens in case of in terms of access control will go through the policy and procedure, and that's my go-to point. The next one is really on the role-based access part, right? It's a classic developer testing and prod environment sort of example, wherein if I'm a developer, I needn't have access to the production environment, and my access should be based on my role. Again, that is challengeable. That's quite debatable out there in the market, but yeah, this is how it is at the moment. The next one is really on the privilege access management. So any privilege access management, such as your root user, super user, needs to be governed, needs to be properly monitored, and make sure that this part is being handled quite properly, because anyone with the privileged access can have malicious intent, and even if they don't, based on their misjudgment or based on their misconfiguration, things could go wrong. It's just takes one mistake to make the entire network or entire company vulnerable to. So we need to make sure that as a firm, the privilege access management is monitored along with the other accesses as well, of course. um, we do also perform access reviews on a periodic basis. So it depends on the kind of systems, kind of applications that you are using within your firm. And crown jewels is just the fancy terms for your most important systems and applications out there in your network or in your company, right? And you need to perform a periodic user access review on those. You need to make sure that what you're saying you're doing actually on that on the ground, right? Because in certain cases, what I've seen is that the access is not revoked in a timely manner, and it gets identified in the user access review, the periodic access review, and that's where you do that, right? That you have some time to mitigate the damage, if any. I've already spoken about this, so it's more on the logging and monitoring. So any logs, such as your successful access, right, unsuccessful access, attempt to access to a particular system. So these kind of small events needs to be monitored and logged on a regular basis, and needs to be make sure that you have those parameters in place being monitored, and then that goes through the SIM tool or SO tool or whatever it is, and any anomalies are being identified and actioned upon. And the last one and the most important stuff is the awareness to the user. Again, backing back to my initial point, you could have the most expensive tool in the world. You could have PAM, you could have SOAR, you could have XO, right, which is really expensive, right? You could have any expensive tool in the world, but if your users don't know how exactly it needs to be configured and used, it's of no use. So this is something that's really important. All right. So the next one is really on the physical security part of it, part of cybersecurity, right? Now we do. I understand that I've spoken to a lot of leaders. Sorry. I speak to a lot of people in the cybersecurity field out there, and there is a common notion within the field saying that physical security is not really related to cybersecurity. It's more how you prevent the office premise and stuff like that, right? And that's a common notion. um, so I would probably say that, in my opinion, yes, it is related to cyber as well as your non-tech as well, right? Because what if you have a local data center, right, and if you're managing all your data locally within your premise, right, in that case it does fall under the purview of cybersecurity or technical side of it, if I have to put it that way, right? You need to make sure that you're protecting your data center, your server room, white room. So white room is something that I'm sure that if some of you may know, white room is something wherein the developers have access to a certain flow, a certain room, wherein you don't allow access anything, right? Any digital. So you can't take your mobile phones, you can't take your smart watches or anything. It's just that you go into that room, you are provided with a desktop, and you just work on it and be back. So that is your white room. So you need to make sure that you're protecting your critical room, critical physical areas. But to protect these, you need to first identify that what are your critical physical areas. It could even be your finance team as well, right, where your finance team is sitting. Because if you have financial documents being printed out, even that is really critical to your firm. That is your asset, right? And that becomes really important, and you need to protect that as well. So the first and foremost thing is to identify your critical physical areas, such as your data center, server room, white room. It could be a team wherein some of your core teams are sitting, or any C-level executive people are sitting, right? And then you outline appropriate processes, again your policy and a procedure document being signed off and being governed by the by the top level executives. And you need to have a strong incident response in place. What if there's a terrorist attack? What if there is another pandemic, right? What if there's flood, earthquake, right, and whatnot? Because we have got some of the clients, they reside in some of the areas which is earthquake prone areas, right, or which are flood prone areas. What do we do in those cases, right? We need to activate the incident response. We need to activate the crisis management and whatnot, right? So you need to have a strong incident response in place to make sure that you identify and you have playbooks for that, and you train your team on that as well, right? You have CCTV cameras and alarms. It goes without saying. We now have CCTV cameras in our homes as well. So might as well have the entire coverage within the office premises as well. Have appropriate access control. So when I say have appropriate access control, it's more on your physical access control to certain areas, right? And this is really interesting because there are many cases of insider threat, right? So insider, such as your insider trading, there are insider threats which lets, if I have malicious intent, right, I could have a threat actor being accessed within the office premises and do whatever they want to, right? So to prevent these as well, we need to have some playbooks defined, some threat scenarios defined, at least on whatever we have data available and things that had happened in the past across the globe. We could have that identified and do that. Again, risk cannot be mitigated to zero, but whatever we can do, we need to do. So that's more or less on the three critical control areas that I wanted to touch upon in this webinar. I'm happy to talk about more. If you want to, please connect me after this call. The next one I really wanted to talk about is the importance of the technical knowledge in GRC. Now, another point, because I know that there are certain notions around this. I mean, there are certain notions about the GRC field as well, that you don't have to be as technical, you don't have to be a coder, and so on. I do agree that partially, but this is the points that you see here are my personal opinion based on my experience and based on the people I have worked with across the globe. So technical skills, in my opinion, are as important as in GRC as non-tech. Again, you don't have to be a coder. You don't have to develop, you know, RCE. You don't have to develop anything of that sort. However, on the flip side, you need to understand how the technology works, right? If I happen to audit something, right? If I happen to audit Active Directory, if I happen to assess or implement, the Active Directory and Azure AD and federated authentication and whatnot, if I don't know how that works in the first place, what I'm going to do, what value add I'm going to do in terms of GRC, right? So to make a robust framework, to make a robust risk assessment, I need to know how the technology works, and that's why technical knowledge is really important. At the moment, I see that, at least in my experience, not a lot of people who are in GRC would be as technical, but the demand is growing for technical GRC peeps, and they are really in demand. So if you are, and that's something that I'll touch upon in the next slide, if you are a tech person who are trying to transition into GRC, you would be as valuable as someone else out there in the market. You need to know, again, the know-hows of the technical aspect, because that leads to me my third point. If you know that how technology works, and if you have hands-on, and that's really great, you would know that how an evolving cyber threat landscape would look like, right? We have got we have got AI swarming in across the industries, right? And it's being integrated largely within the firm. How would you protect that? One of the recent clients that I worked with, it's a government agency in Sydney, across Australia, and they were really concerned about their employees using AI tools out there, like ChatGPT and whatnot, right? Because if people are uploading confidential data on GPT or any other AI tool for that matter, how would they control it? How would they know what's happening, right? What kind of company data are being uploaded? How do they control that? So we need to understand the cyber threat landscape, which is ever evolving, and for that you need to know the technical know-how. So you need to understand how the technicalities or the technical aspect works. And fourth, and the most important part, I think I have already touched upon that briefly in my previous slide, that you as a GRC professional, if you have a good technical capability, you would be that person who would be bridging the gap between the technical teams and the non-tech teams, right? When I say non-tech teams, it's more on the executive level and the board level. Also, people who are from the other teams who are non-tech. So say that if you are to draft a framework for physical security, right? You need to talk to procurement team, you need to talk to the admin team, you need to talk to the security guards for that matter, right? How would you translate technicalities into, or the best practices out there in the industry from a cyber perspective, into business language? And that's where your business acumen will come into play, right? That's a really good skill to have in the GRC. Good communication skill, good business acumen, a skill wherein you are able to contemplate technical data into the non-tech language, so it's easier for people to understand. And at the same time, if you have to talk to the developers, right? If you don't know what a CI/CD is, what a DevSecOps is, or anything, any latest tools or frameworks out there in the market which is being used, um, how would you assess that in the first place, right? And that's why I feel that technical knowledge is really important in the GRC field, and that also helps you to stay ahead, to stand out in the job market. Because what I've seen out there in the market is that any GRC personnel who are really hands-on with the technical aspect, or they're really good with the technical, they would be preferred over anyone else. So that's really the importance of having technical knowledge in the GRC field. The next one is really into the career transition into GRC and the cybersecurity field. So this is, again, it's a very brief list, and if you don't see your role here, it's not that it's not being recognized, or it's not that as a professional or probably as a hiring manager, I wouldn't look at. I would definitely look at. It's just that if you're transitioning from a career, I probably started this way. So there are two aspects to it. The first one is really is people who are experienced, right? Have a tech background, any sort of tech background, network administrator, IT help desk professional, auditors, consultant, or anyone for that matter, right? Then we have got freshers, right, who really don't have experience out there in the market. And to be honest, from the market's perspective, I've seen that it's really difficult for the freshers to break into the market. That's one, and I do recognize that. But at the same time, there are things that you could do as a fresher to stand out there, right? You've got you've got a lot of probably a lot of tools and technologies at your disposal to learn things and to showcase in the first place, right? Like try hack me, hack the box, and whatnot, right? So you could build a portfolio out there, and that really brings you out or stands you out there in the market from a professional perspective. So if you have any fresher, or if you know any fresher who's there in the call, or if they are not, if you have any questions, we could have those conversations in the Q&A session based on my experience, and we could talk more on that. From an experience personal perspective, if you have got a tech background, it's I wouldn't say it's easier, but I would say relatively you would be recognized more than anyone else. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is to people coming from the risk and compliance professionals, right? Really the line two people from the three lines of defense, right? So we have got operational risk people, we have got financial risk people, and I've seen they have made a move to the GRC field, right? It's easier for them because they understand the risk culture, right? And it's easier for them to understand the risk culture from a cyber perspective as well. Having said that, I've also seen people from HR department whom I really know personally making a move to cybersecurity. I have known people from biotech, mechanical engineering, from literacy moving to cybersecurity. So it's not that one cannot do. It's just that you need to find the right path. And the other part which I probably missed is networking. You really need to network with the right people to transition into the career. At times you could have the in a room full of 50 people, you could be the most experienced and most knowledgeable person in the room. But at the same time, you would not be able to make it because probably one is not good with the networking part of it. And I have been there. Having said that, I have been there. I've been on the other side of the table as well, and it's really difficult to be frank.